Keir Starmer's trust collapse. Ranked, the 10 forces tearing British politics apart. The key decisions that made Starmer Britain's lightning rod. As of January 28, 2026, Prime Minister Keir Starmer is facing a political problem that no longer behaves like a normal midterm wobble. His personal standing is deeply negative, his government is routinely accused of rule-bending and overreach, and the opposition landscape has fractured into a multi-exit system, most notably Reform UK, which has learned how to turn distrust into a simple, repeatable story. Polling captures the scale of the slide. In YouGov's latest favorability tracker, Starmer sits at a net -57. That is not just unpopular, it is a credibility deficit that makes every policy fight feel like evidence of a larger betrayal. One sentence explains why the criticism keeps compounding. A growing slice of the public believes the state is tightening control over speech, protest, and borders while being inconsistent and self-protective. The story turns on whether Labour can restore perceived fairness and consistency before reform turns protest energy into a durable majority lane. Key points. Starmer's personal standing is at a modern low. YouGov puts him at net -57 in January 2026. Reform has transformed rules anger into a stable voting coalition and has recently polled ahead of Labour nationally in YouGov's survey of Westminster voting intentions. Immigration and asylum are now central to Starmer's vulnerability. Labour has moved to a harder line but still gets hit from both sides, too harsh and not effective. A protest and policing backlash is feeding the same meta-narrative as online safety. The state is widening its enforcement perimeter. The Online Safety Act has become a cultural flashpoint. Age checks, Ofcom enforcement, and the VPN generation effect have politicized the internet itself. Case contrasts. Lucy Connolly versus the acquittal of a suspended Labour councillor keep two-tier justice claims alive, regardless of legal differences between cases. Election postponements in parts of England have given opponents a democracy erosion frame that is hard to rebut quickly. Background. Starmer's political identity is procedural, law, institutions, and competence. That can be an asset in a crisis, but it becomes a liability in a legitimacy fight, because voters expect rules-first leaders to be consistent and to protect ordinary people from arbitrary power. In early 2026, the public mood is not just fed up, it is structurally suspicious. Policies on speech, protest, and immigration are being interpreted through one overriding question: who gets constrained and who gets protected? That lens turns isolated controversies into a single story with momentum. Analysis. Rank 1. The numbers are now the story. A leader can survive unpopular decisions if the public believes they are acting in good faith and in control. Starmer's issue is that his personal reputation has deteriorated to the point where people no longer presume his intentions. YouGov's January 2026 tracker puts him at net -57, a level that places him among the most disliked modern UK prime ministers. Once a leader hits this zone, opponents don't need to win arguments. They just need to attach new events to an existing impression: inconsistency, overreach, and unfairness. Rank 2. Immigration and asylum, hardening policy, widening distrust. Immigration has become the central pressure point because it combines cost, identity, and visible state capacity. Labour has tightened its posture. Ministers have framed the asylum regime as a pull factor, proposed sweeping changes including temporary protection status and a much longer route to permanent settlement, and signalled a tougher interpretation of human rights constraints. That shift creates a trap. From the right, Reform argues Labour is late, weak, and still not stopping crossings. From the left and civil society, critics argue the state is escalating deterrence in ways that punish vulnerable people and increase humanitarian risk. The flashpoints are concrete. The government's own asylum and returns policy statement indicates plans to remove the legal duty to support asylum seekers who would otherwise be destitute, returning it to a discretionary power. At the same time, the Home Office has publicly emphasized joint work with France, including a pilot return mechanism for small boat arrivals. The combined effect is politically combustible, enforcement optics go up, but public confidence does not necessarily follow. Rank 3. The crackdown state frame, protests, policing, and the backlash. A government that looks heavy-handed on protest fuels the same legitimacy narrative as online speech rules. The state is widening the boundaries of enforcement. The most dramatic examples are the mass arrest events tied to demonstrations about Palestine action after the group was proscribed. Police reported hundreds of arrests at some protests and close to 900 at another. Regardless of where one stands on the underlying conflict, the political consequence is clear. Large-scale arrests become a symbol of a government willing to use the toughest tools in contested political spaces. Human rights organizations have also warned that proposed or continuing legislative changes risk deepening a protest crackdown by broadening police powers and protest restrictions. During a period of low trust, this critique intensifies the perception that the government is managing dissent instead of responding to it. Rank 4. Online Safety Act. Age checks, enforcement measures, and implications for the VPN generation. The Online Safety Act has become more than a child protection policy. The Online Safety Act has evolved into a proxy conflict that affects privacy, speech, and the structure of public spaces. Since age checks rolled out, reported data showed a sharp surge in VPN usage. That matters politically because it reads like a policy teaching everyday circumvention. If the state builds gates, people learn to route around them. The internet loses its inherent sense of openness. Ofcom's enforcement has escalated the situation as significant fines and investigations indicate a strong government commitment. Supporters argue this is the point: serious enforcement to protect children. Critics argue the incentives push platforms toward over-restriction, driving lawful users into masked behavior and shrinking the space for normal expression. Rank 5, two-tier justice, stays alive because symbols beat legal nuance. The strongest fuel for the two-tier claim is not a statute. It is contrast. Lucy Connolly pleaded guilty to inciting racial hatred and received a 31-month prison sentence, upheld on appeal. Separately, a suspended Labour councillor, Ricky Jones, was acquitted by a jury after being prosecuted for encouraging violent disorder following inflammatory remarks at a protest. The offences, evidence, and legal tests differ. But politics does not run on case law. It runs on perceived fairness. When voters see harsh punishment in one high-profile speech case and a not guilty verdict in another, the system looks selective, even when the outcomes are procedurally legitimate. Rank 6. Elections postponed. Administrative rationale, democracy optics. The government has confirmed it will legislate to postpone elections for 29 councils in England, arguing the delays release capacity to deliver local government reorganisation. Even if the administrative case is defensible, the politics are brutal. Opponents can frame it as cancelling democracy, and many voters will hear motive rather than process. In a legitimacy spiral, postponement becomes proof of rule-bending, not reform. Rank 7. Internal Labour fractures. Authority leaks from the inside. When a Prime Minister is popular, internal party tensions are background noise. When they are deeply unpopular, those tensions become part of the public case against competence. Labour has carried visible strains, control versus openness arguments, ideological discomfort over migration and policing, and leadership-style criticism. The Angela Rayner saga, her resignation after a tax and standards controversy and the reshuffle that followed, deepened the sense of instability and factional vulnerability at the top. Rank 8. Grooming gangs inquiry. An institutional truth test. The independent inquiry into grooming gangs is politically explosive because it sits at the intersection of state failure, safeguarding, and the fear that institutions avoided action due to cultural sensitivity and reputational risk. The government established the inquiry in response to Baroness Louise Casey's national audit and published draft terms of reference. The inquiry itself is not anti-anyone, but it will be interpreted as a referendum on whether the system tells the truth about itself, especially on ethnicity, institutional caution, and accountability for past inaction. Rank 9. World stage scrutiny. Chagos, Mauritius, and the UK second accusation. Foreign policy rarely drives UK popularity until it becomes a competence signal. The Chagos-Mauritius deal turned into exactly that. The deal transfers sovereignty while securing Diego Garcia under a 99-year lease with annual payments, and it has drawn criticism from lawmakers, Chagossian advocates, and international bodies. It also became entangled in US politics after President Trump attacked the deal as a weakness. Domestically, the issue is less about the Indian Ocean and more about narrative. Critics frame it as a government prioritizing international pressures and elite diplomacy, while domestic problems feel unresolved. Rank 10, Persona and Psychology. The Prime Minister, acting as a prosecutor, is in a mood that demands warmth. Starmer's style is controlled, legalistic, and cautious. In a trust-rich environment, that reads as seriousness. In a trust-poor environment, it can read as distance and management. That matters because it changes how voters interpret every controversy. A rules-first leader who appears inconsistent looks worse than a flamboyant one who never claimed to be predictable. And in a multi-party era, emotional connection is not decoration, it's political infrastructure. What most coverage misses. The hinge is procedural legitimacy, the feeling that the government is changing how people live, speech, protest, voting and borders, without a shared mandate and without consistent standards. The mechanism is cumulative. Immigration hardening feeds anxiety about state power. Protest crackdowns feed fear of dissent being punished. Enforcement of online safety fosters a perception of internet gatekeeping and surveillance. Case contrasts feed suspicion that justice is selective. Election delays feed a sense that the rules are movable. Two signposts would confirm this spiral is hardening over the next weeks. First, the question is whether the public agenda continues to prioritize rules and enforcement stories over results stories. Second, whether reform keeps consolidating support across multiple demographics rather than spiking only during controversy. What changes now? In the short term, Starmer's problem is not passing legislation. The issue lies in regaining the trust of the public. That requires visible self-constraint and clearer lines on protest powers, on speech enforcement thresholds, on asylum policy trade-offs, and on when elections can be postponed. If the public does not believe the state is fair and predictable, even competent delivery will fail to translate into trust. The main consequence is clear. As legitimacy declines, implementing any policy becomes more difficult, because every decision is viewed as an exercise of control rather than a provision of service. Real-world impact. A young person discovers that age gates exist, which leads them to learn about VPNs. As VPNs become commonplace, institutions inherently adopt an adversarial stance. A worker stops posting political views because the boundary between offensive and illegal feels unclear, so debate shifts into private channels and resentment hardens in silence. When a voter in the affected council area learns about the postponement of their election, they come to the conclusion that participation is optional, leading to an increase in protest voting and disengagement. An asylum system that swings between toughness and backlog creates anger on all sides. Communities feel strain, advocates see cruelty, and the government looks both harsh and ineffective at once. The question that decides Starmer's future. Starmer's opponents are selling one message: you are being managed, not represented. That message is thriving because it fits multiple controversies at once. To break it, Labour needs fewer procedural defences and more visible restraint, fewer headline initiatives that later wobble, tighter democratic standards on postponements, clearer guardrails on protest policing, and an asylum approach that looks both humane and credible. If Starmer cannot shift the legitimacy narrative, his unpopularity becomes structural, and in a fragmented Britain, structural unpopularity turns into electoral math fast. For deeper insight and less noise, subscribe and explore the full range at taylortaylor.co.uk.